Hi everybody, it's Sasha from Pictou County Solid Waste, and today I'm going to be walking you through backyard composting for beginners. This presentation was put together to celebrate International Compost Awareness Week, so I'm so excited to go through it with you. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this presentation is how great composting is for our environment. Composting not only dramatically reduces the amount of waste being sent to landfill, but it also is very beneficial to our soil and can help out your lawn, your garden, or your shrubs. So I'm really excited to get into it. And one thing I will say is if you are thinking about starting your own backyard compost pile, don't put your leaves out for town leaf collection because you're going to want to keep those for your compost pile. Today we're going to be talking about our waste problem, what compost is and why it's beneficial, methods and options for backyard composting, what to include and what not to include in your pile, location, maintaining your pile, and finally compost application. So before we get into how to compost, it's important that we talk about why it's so important that we compost in the first place. So as we can see from a recent landfill analysis, despite our great municipal composting program and our efforts, we can see that 24% of material in landfill is actually organics. So that's our food waste. And you may think that that's not a big problem, that it's all going to eventually break down anyway. But the problem with it is when food breaks down in a landfill, it creates and releases a gas called methane. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas that is even more potent and harmful to our environment than carbon dioxide. And so when we can divert our food away from landfill, not only are we helping free up landfill space, we're also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and we are turning our lovely food scraps into something useful as compost rather than having them just sit in a landfill and rot. So that is great. And one thing I will say also is that our main priority is reducing food waste overall. So composting is great and we love to do it, but the most important thing is reducing. So you can go visit www.lovefoodhatewaste.ca to learn some great tips on how you can reduce your food waste. So let's start at the very beginning. Composting is the natural process through which organic material breaks down and is converted into a nutrient-rich, soil-like product called humus that can be used as a type of conditioner for gardens, lawns, and more. And the composting process is helped along by microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and worms that break down food that we add to our compost pile. They say that composting is nature's way of recycling, and it's one of my favorite things to do and great for our garden. There are tons of benefits to composting, and composting not only reduces waste and helps the environment, but it's an incredibly important ingredient for healthy soil and productive soil. Other things that it can do, I've listed some of the benefits here, but it can also do other things like help decrease soil erosion. When soil erosion happens, it often strips all of the nutrients from our soil, and by adding some compost back into that soil, we can help add more nutrients in. It also helps to improve soil structure and can reduce the need to actually water our plants in our garden. It also reduces the need for pesticides because compost can help suppress plant diseases. So you can keep your garden nice and natural using compost and don't have to use any pesticides. This compost also results in having darker soil and it better holds the sun's warmth. So your plants are going to be nice and warm and happy and grow really well. So first you have to choose how you want to compost. And there are lots of different ways. Composting can be made to fit your lifestyle. So there are indoor bins and outdoor bins and bins of varying sizes, depending on the amount of people in your family and the amount of compost that or the amount of organic material that you produce. So whether you're choosing to buy a bin or choosing to build your own or just having a compost pile out in the open, that's up to you, but you want to consider how much material you have and also how much space you have to have a compost pile, as well as how much time and effort you want to go into maintaining your bin and how quickly you want your finished product. Compost can take up between 2 months to up to 2 years, depending on what composting method you're using. So for example, if I'm using a cold composting method, which doesn't require a lot of effort, that is going to maybe be great for my lifestyle, but it means that I'm going to have to wait a lot longer to get the finished product finished compost. So it really just depends on what your time frame is and what you want to get out of your composting pile. So there are lots of different methods of composting, and I'm going to talk about a few of them here. The first being in-vessel method, and the second being vermicomposting, so that's using worms. The other is trench composting, where you just have to dig a trench and put that material right in there. And the other is open air hot and cold composting. So I'm going to show a few different pictures. This first one here is an in-vessel method, where you just put the material in the top and your finished compost will come out in the bottom. This method is pretty easy because you can just go out and buy something like this, and as long as you're following the correct recipe and stirring it every once in a while, it's pretty easy to maintain. This is a homemade version of a composter, and you can use a Rubbermaid bin. You could also use a plastic trash bin. For this one, you're going to need a few different modifications, such as drilling holes in the sides so that you can increase your airflow. But it's easy to do and something that's going to still produce the same result. This is another in-vessel method. This is a tumbler, and some people find this easier just to rotate the bin rather than having to use a shovel or a pitchfork to actually turn the pile. And this is actually an example of an indoor composter, and this composter here is for vermicomposting. And I'm not going to talk about vermicomposting today, but that might be a future video. If people are interested in the wonderful world of worms and composting with them, then maybe we can do that as a future video. And this is an example of a open air pile, and this can be a hot pile or cold pile depending on how much you want to maintain it. And you also don't have to spend any money to make a compost pile. You can just compost right in your backyard just with a pile, or you can build a wooden structure like this where you can put your materials in just to kind of keep it contained. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about hot composting mostly, and this can refer to an open pile like this, or even an in-vessel method depending on what you choose. So once you've chosen your composter, you need to know what to include and what not to include in your pile. You're going to want to avoid meat and dairy products in your backyard composter to avoid attracting unwanted pests and animals, and to keep your pile free from odors. Many people have concerns about attracting animals. However, if you keep the dairy and meats out and have a cover on your compost bin, you will avoid this problem. The other great thing is that you're always going to make sure that whenever you're putting food in your compost bin, you're also putting a layer of browns like leaves and twigs on top of that food, and that's going to help contain any odor that you might have. Other things you're going to want to avoid are weeds that have gone to seed and diseased plants. Your backyard compost pile will not get hot enough to kill these plants, and you don't want them in your compost pile. You don't want any active seeds that could grow. But you are going to want to put things like your fruit and vegetable scraps, your eggshells, your coffee bags, coffee and tea bags, any sort of shredded paper and things like that. And that is going to be really good for your compost pile. Another thing you're going to want to consider once you've purchased your compost bin is the location that it's going to go. So you want to choose a location that's convenient and accessible all year round, and one that has good drainage. So make sure you find a nice sunny area where it will absorb and retain as much heat as possible. It's also important to have something in the sun because in the springtime, your compost pile tends to produce excess moisture, and so you want to have it in a nice sunny spot. A tip to promote good drainage is to place small sticks and twigs at the bottom of your compost pile, and this is going to help with your drainage and your aeration. A hot compost pile or in-vessel method is the quickest way to produce finished compost. A hot compost pile can reach temperatures between 49 to 77 degrees Celsius and should be about a 3-foot cube at minimum. A 4-foot cube is preferred. The pile will shrink as the ingredients decompose, so keep that in mind and make sure that you have enough material to keep your compost pile active. There are 4 main things you need: greens, browns, air, and moisture. The first thing for your successful compost is to have 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. The carbon source is your browns, such as leaves, wood chips, and shredded paper. The nitrogen source is your greens, and that includes all your fruit and vegetable waste, your coffee grounds, your eggshells, that sort of thing. You're going to do the next part, which is the fun part, which is adding all of the organic waste by alternating it in layers, just like a cake. So you're going to have, you're starting with your browns, and the very first layer that you're going to put in your compost pile, make sure that that one has a little bit more twigs in it, and that's going to really help to promote some airflow. So start with your layer of browns, and then alternate and put a layer of your greens in there, and continue until the compost pile is about between 2 and 3 feet high. You may also need to troubleshoot a little bit. Place a thermometer in your compost pile, and that way you can keep an eye on how hot it's getting and if it's reaching the correct temperature. If you find that you're not seeing any heat from your compost pile, it may be a sign that you need some more nitrogen, so you get some more greens in there. So have those things to consider. As I mentioned, it's really important that your compost pile has moisture. So you're going to want to make sure to water your compost pile and make sure that it's the consistency of something like a damp sponge. Make sure it's not soaking wet, and if it does end up getting too wet, then you can just add some browns like your leaves or twigs to your pile. And same if your compost pile ends up being too dry, you can just add some more greens like your food scraps to the pile. Another thing that's really important is oxygen. So you're going to want to make sure that you're turning your pile about once a week. You don't want to turn your pile too much because if you turn it too often, it can lose its heat and that can hinder the process of producing the compost. So about 1 week or even every 2 weeks is preferable, and that's going to really help your pile and make sure things are breaking down properly. And as I mentioned, as things start to decompose, your pile is going to shrink. So make sure that you have enough volume to add things to your pile as things start to decompose. You can tell when your compost is done when it is a dark color, it's a little bit crumbly, and it has an earthy smell. One of the best ways to test if your compost is finished is to put a little bit of it in a plastic bag and wait a few days. After a few days, open up your plastic bag, and if you're hit with a really strong bad smell, then your compost is not done. When you open your plastic bag, your compost should smell earthy and good, a little bit sweet, and that's how you know your compost is done. Once you have your finished compost, you can start to apply it to things like your plants, your garden beds, your shrubs. You can put it on your lawn. You can use it in a lot of different ways. Also, gift it to a friend who is an avid gardener and they can use it in their beds. There's lots of different ways. You can mix it with your potting soil for use in your potted houseplants. And another thing is if you are using it for a vegetable garden, before you plant anything in your vegetable garden, mix some of that compost with the soil and leave it for a few days. And that's going to really help even more boost the nutrient content in the soil. You can also just put it as a top dressing over top if you've already planted some vegetables. But you can see in this post here some specific instructions about how to add that compost. And you can also visit compost.org to see more specifics about how to add compost into your gardens and things like that. Another great thing that you can do with compost is to make compost tea. So all you need to do is fill a cloth bag with compost and put it in a barrel or a bucket, and the mixture should be about 1 part compost to 5 parts water. And you're going to let that sit for about a week and just stir it a few times. And once that is done, then you can pour that tea over your plants, and that's going to really give them an extra boost of nutrients. So that's something fun that you can do with your compost. That's everything for the Backyard Composter Beginner Guide, and you can find more information at www.compost.org. And you can also always reach us online if you have any questions on our website or any of our social media pages. And if you want to see more videos on how to compost or things like vermicomposting, please let us know in the comments, as well as any questions that you had about starting your own compost pile. Let us know. We want to hear from you, and we want to help any way that we can. So happy International Compost Week. We hope you all get out into your garden and celebrate.